Summer 1947. The dawn of the Cold War, and the skies above New Mexico are patrolled, not by aliens but by secret balloons. Under Project Mogul, the US Army Air Forces launched string after string of these experimental high-altitude devices from Alamogordo Army Airfield. Their mission? Detect Soviet nuclear tests from afar. Flying at the edge of space, they carried microphones, radar reflectors, and sensitive gear hidden in massive balloon clusters. One such train was launched on June 4th, 1947, and was later lost about 17 miles from rancher W.W. Mac Brazel's property near Corona, New Mexico. In late June, Brazel returned to that site on his ranch. Among the desert scrub, he found metallic tapes, tin foil, rubber, and thin wooden rods tasseled across several acres. And some reports included an engine. Materials unlike anything he had seen before. This took place during a craze of flying disc sightings in the area, but Brazel didn't own a telephone or radio, so he was completely unaware of this, adding further to his confusing discovery. Kenneth Arnold famously reported seeing 9 flying discs, which led to around 800 similar UFO sightings in the area. It was Brazel's uncle Hollis Wilson who first believed that this debris could have potentially come from one of the sighted flying discs. Hundreds of reports were made over that weekend, with newspaper outlets speculating it being a Soviet operation, offering $3,000 as a reward for any physical proof, which would be around $42,000 today. It was on July the 6th when Sheriff Wilcox contacted Roswell Army Airfield, the only unit capable of delivering nuclear weapons, which dispatched Major Jesse Marcel and Captain Sheridan Cavett. They retrieved the scattered wreckage and reported back to Commanding Officer General Roger Ramsey. RAAF's Public Information Officer Walter Haut read an extraordinary statement that the Air Force had recovered a flying disc on a local ranch. Witnesses in Fort Worth, like flight engineer Robert Porter, described it as wrapped in paper, lightweight, and small enough to fit inside a car trunk. News broke over radio station KSWS from director George Walsh, which led to the phone lines becoming overwhelmed with callers. Quote, "All afternoon I tried to call Sheriff Wilcox for more information, but could never get through to him. Media people called me from all over the world." End quote. However, on July the 9th, everyone's hopes were dashed when General Roger Ramsey, as well as Weather Officer Irving Newton, confirmed that the debris had come from a weather balloon, which were commonly used across 80 other weather stations at the time. At this point, news reports suddenly changed their tune and reported that there was actually no metal or engine parts that had been found, and that it was only rubber strips, tin foil, paper, tape, and sticks. Military personnel provided accounts of mundane weather balloons being used the previous year, though these were proven to have been falsified. They claimed that the balloons were used to gain meteorological data, which also wasn't true. Interest in UFOs temporarily died down after a crashed disc was reported in Twin Falls, Idaho, just a day after Roswell. But this was proven to have been a hoax by 4 teenagers using parts of a jukebox. However, over the years, the belief in the US government covering up UFO sightings became increasingly popular, believing that the spotted flying saucers were unknown military aircrafts, which in turn became synonymous with alien encounters. JFK was assassinated in 1963, followed by the infamous Watergate scandal in the years that followed, leading to a huge distrust of the government, and conspiracy theories began to become more widely accepted. And it didn't help that the story of Roswell suddenly became more and more twisted over the years. In 1948, there was a crashed saucer found in Aztec, New Mexico, but this was exposed as being a hoax. However, this story involved recovering the bodies of aliens, and over time this somehow became connected with Roswell in error. The pranksters even managed to convince Variety columnist Frank Scully to write about their crash, including small grey humanoid bodies and metal that was stronger than any found on Earth. He wrote about indecipherable writing and that the government had covered it up to prevent public panic, all of which was somehow incorporated into the Roswell story in the years that followed. What started as a select few pieces of material being found on a ranch now somehow included the sighting of actual flying discs and the bodies of aliens. Air Force investigator James McAndrew stated, quote, "Even with the exposure of this obvious fraud, the Aztec story is still revered by UFO theorists. Elements of this story occasionally re-emerge and are thought to be the catalyst for other crashed flying saucer stories, including the Roswell Incident." End quote. It was in 1969 when Betty and Barney Hill claimed to have had an alien encounter which increased interest in the extraterrestrial once again. It was in 1974 when sci-fi author and conspiracy theorist Robert Spencer Carr claimed that alien bodies were recovered from Aztec in Hangar 18, despite this hangar not even existing, and he claimed that his sources had even witnessed an alien autopsy. But again, these claims were incorporated into the Roswell story instead of Aztec. Carr's son would later claim that his dad often, quote, mortified my mother and me by spinning preposterous stories in front of strangers. Tales of befriending a giant alligator in the Florida swamps and sharing complex philosophical ideas with porpoises in the Gulf of Mexico, end quote. It was in 1978 when ufologist Stanton Friedman interviewed Major Marcel in depth, and it was here when Marcel officially claimed that the weather balloon story was a cover-up. He believed that the debris was in fact from an alien. Even Brazel himself wasn't convinced by this story. Quote, I am sure that what I found was not any weather observation balloon, end quote. Bob Pratt's December 1979 interview led to the February 1980 Enquirer piece. Marcel described extraordinary materials, foil that uncrumpled by itself, lightweight insulation, and unusual wooden beams. Hosted by Leonard Nimoy, the episode of In Search Of featured Marcel. Quote, they wanted some comments from me, but I wasn't at liberty to do that, so all I could do is keep my mouth shut. And General Ramsey is the one who told the newspapers, the newsmen, what it was and to forget about it. It is nothing more than a weather observation balloon. Of course, we both knew differently, end quote. Marcel's son, Jesse A. Marcel Jr., later told ufologists that when he was 10 years old, his father showed him some flying saucer debris he recovered from the crash, including, quote, a small beam with purple-hued hieroglyphics on it, end quote. However, these all matched symbols on the adhesive tape that Project Mogul had sourced from a New York toy manufacturer. Friedman and William Moore's book wove Marcel's story into a global tale of crashed saucers, alien bodies, and a US government cosmic Watergate. This included alleged craft remains 150 miles away and suppressed transmissions from Albuquerque radio, which were all later debunked as fabrications. Between 1978 and the early 90s, UFO researchers interviewed countless people who were involved in the Roswell accident, but they all gave conflicting reports. It was in October of 1980 when the book The Roswell Incident was published, containing fictitious events which only further spiraled conspiracy theories. The book claimed that an extraterrestrial craft was flying over the New Mexico desert to observe some nuclear weapons activity before a lightning strike killed the aliens. He claimed that after recovering the alien technology, the US government engaged in a cover-up to prevent mass panic. He claimed to have interviewed over 90 witnesses for the book, but it only contained 25, and only 7 of them actually saw the debris, and only 5 of those had actually handled it. At this point, Brazel had passed away, but his son William was interviewed, and he claimed that his father was arrested by the military and sworn to secrecy. However, during the time that he was supposedly in custody, he had actually been spotted in Roswell, and even took part in an interview with the radio station KGFL. Brazel's daughter Bessie Schreiber was also interviewed, who was only 14 at the time of Roswell. Quote, there was what appeared to be pieces of heavily waxed paper and a sort of aluminium-like foil. Some of the metal foil pieces had a sort of tape stuck to them, and when they were held up to the light, they showed what looked like pastel flowers, end quote. The book claimed that Marcel provided false statements about his own military career and educational background, which was all unconfirmed. But after it came out, many ufologists received anonymous government documents, and all of those who received these were connected in some way to Bill Moore. He was well known within the UFO community, most notably for spreading misinformation. But many approached him claiming to be Air Force intelligence officers, offering to produce hard evidence of extraterrestrial retrievals to recruit him. Moore planned to put together a non-fiction book, but he had no evidence to fall back on. He admitted that his goal was to, quote, get as much of the story out with as little fiction as possible, end quote. Moore, Friedman, and Jamie Shandera soon joined together to supposedly form a phony organisation known as Majestic 12, though there's no paperwork to actually confirm this company's existence. On August 5th, 1989, Friedman interviewed former mortician Glenn Dennis, who claimed again that Roswell contained alien bodies, which was backed up by several other ufologists. He claimed that he received 4 or 5 calls from the airbase with questions about body preservation and requesting small or hermetically sealed caskets. He also claimed that a local nurse told him she had personally witnessed an alien autopsy, stating that her name was either Naomi Self or Naomi Maria Self, but upon research, no such nurse of this this name existed in the military in 1947. Friedman then admitted that he had made the name up and that she was really called Naomi Sipes. However, she also didn't exist, and Friedman confessed to making up this one as well. On September the 20th, the stories continued when Unsolved Mysteries covered Roswell and claimed that alien bodies were captured by the army and then transported to Texas. This was viewed by 28 million people, with Dennis being portrayed and later dramatized in a TV movie called Roswell. This only spread the misinformation further, leading to multiple books, documentaries, and a UFO museum in Roswell co-founded by Walter Haut. It was that same year when Moore, during a UFO Network conference, confessed to faking evidence of extraterrestrials to UFO researchers, including claiming that alien bodies were ejected from the craft shortly before it exploded over the ranch. His colleague Richard C. Doty himself also later admitted to giving fabricated information over to UFO researchers whilst working at Kirtland Air Force Base. At this point, even conspiracy theorists lost trust and turned their backs on Moore and his fake organization. In 1990, John Keel theorized that the debris actually came from a Japanese balloon bomb launched during the Second World War, but this was discarded by meteorologists as they, quote, could not have stayed aloft for 2 years, end quote. It was in 1991 when Kevin Randall and Donald Schmitt published a book called UFO Crash at Roswell, which sold 160,000 copies. This included more claims of alien bodies, but also got locations and basic details wrong, continuing to spread false information. It only continued that same year when retired US Air Force Brigadier General Thomas DeBose, who had handled and posed with the debris for photos back in 1947, admitted, quote, the weather balloon explanation for the material was a cover story to divert the attention of the press, end quote. In 1992, Stanton Friedman released Crash at Corona, including new witnesses now claiming that there were 2 flying saucers and 8 aliens, 2 of which survived and were taken into custody by the government. This included an interview with former teletype operator at the KOAT radio station in Albuquerque, Lydia Sleppy. She claimed that she was once typing up a story about a crashed saucer wreckage, as dictated by reporter Johnny McBoyle, but this was interrupted by an incoming message to end all communications. Friedman was convinced that the FBI were using a nationwide surveillance system, but there was no evidence found of them ever monitoring any transmission from the radio station. Upon investigation, this also would have been impossible based on the teletype model that she was using in 1947, as there would have been no way to interrupt her typing or for the machine to suddenly stop by itself. In 1994, Randall and Schmitt put together another book entitled The Truth About the UFO Crash at Roswell, but things continued to escalate as they claimed that a cargo plane delivered alien bodies to Dwight D. Eisenhower. Supposed witness Frank Kaufman claimed to have monitored a UFO's path on a radar and had recovered debris from a crashed spaceship, similar in shape to an F-117 stealth fighter. However, his story didn't match personnel at the base, his service record, or even the radar technology available at the time. Jim Ragsdale claimed that during a drive home along Highway 285 with girlfriend Trudy Truelove, they both saw a craft that was narrow with a bat-like wing crash, but in a completely different location. However, his story then spun off into him claiming that he and Trudy removed 11 golden helmets from the alien craft to bury in the desert. It was at this point that the Air Force finally decided to respond to all of the conspiracy theories under immense pressure. They finally admitted that the weather balloon explanation was in fact a lie, to cover up the military surveillance program Project Mogul. They claimed that they were experimenting with balloons containing secret recording equipment to spy on the Soviet Union, and that was what was found on the ranch that day. Furthermore, some witnesses claimed to have witnessed seeing military personnel loading aliens into body bags. In actuality, these were most likely parachute test dummies which were being loaded into insulation bags designed to shield temperature-sensitive equipment in the desert. Some of these stories only came out decades later and usually by elderly witnesses, some even on their deathbeds, so it's a possibility that their memories had faded rather than them being maliciously dishonest. The test dummies were used for high-altitude experiments, impeccably consistent with retrieval bags used for Project High Dive dummies, though these claims were often rejected by the UFO community, despite the materials matching the Air Force's claims perfectly. In 1995, British entrepreneur Ray Santilli claimed to possess footage of a real alien autopsy, filmed not long after the Roswell Incident in 1947, that he had purchased from an elderly Army Air Force cameraman, but he would later admit to faking this entire thing, filming it on a set he had built in his London living room. Though the fake autopsy was viewed by 20 million people right before the X-Files, who would later parody it, and it became infamous. It was in 1997 when retired Army intelligence officer Philip J. Corso released a book entitled The Day After Roswell, claiming to have been shown a non-human body suspended in liquid inside a glass coffin, as well as claiming he helped oversee a project to reverse engineer the crash debris, but much like others, he got basic locations wrong when telling the story. He had also previously worked with US Senator and World War II veteran Strom Thurmond, who helped with the book, but unknowingly. Corso convinced him that it was for something else, leading to Thurmond demanding his name be removed. Quote, "I did not and would not pen the foreword to a book about or containing a suggestion that the success of the United States in the Cold War is attributable to the technology found on a crashed UFO." End quote. Administrations downplay the UFO angle. President Clinton ordered reviews finding no evidence of alien contact. President Obama stated, quote, "I gotta tell you, it's a little disappointing. People always ask me about Roswell and the aliens and UFOs, and it turns out the stuff going on that's top secret isn't nearly as exciting as you'd expect. In this day and age, it's not as secret as you'd think." End quote. In June 2020, President Trump quipped that, quote, "I won't talk to you about what I know about it, but it's very interesting." End quote. 75 years after, Roswell still divides the curious from the skeptical. Was it a runway Cold War experiment or the most sensational UFO cover-up of all time? What we do know is extraordinarily mundane. Debris from a secret nuclear monitoring balloon that got lost, and a government caught between acknowledging a covert program and facing UFO hysteria. But the questions about Men in Black, alien remains and government secrecy linger like desert ghosts as we all, from one world to another, continue seeking answers.